Howdy once again, it's Mr. Pete, your YouTube shop teacher. Welcome back to the shop, and this is part one of a two-part video on making a machinist jack. Well, I don't know if I collect these jacks, but I guess there's enough of them here to, some of you are going to call this a collection. But I like the shape of them. I don't use them a whole lot, but I don't know, I just have a fascination with them. I used to have a lot more of these larger jacks, and some much bigger than this. I got rid of them, sometimes called house jacks, but they are screw jacks as opposed to hydraulic jacks with a swivel on the top. And they made some of these that were extraordinarily large that would take two men to move. They are not railroad jacks. They are sometimes for house moving jacks and things like that is what they call them. But I'm interested here in the smaller ones. So let me show you a page out of the 1966 Armstrong Tool Catalog. The catalog calls these planer jacks, and they are used for supporting work, and then the work is clamped down on a planer, and sometimes these work pieces were very large. They might have weighed a ton or more, so they needed to be supported by a strong fixture or jack such as this. And they made these in 4 sizes. The larger one weighed 12 pounds. Now, part one of this video is strictly talking about jacks, how I'm going to do it, making the wooden pattern, a split pattern, and then making the castings. And in the second part, I will machine the casting. And of all of these you see here, this is the one that I'm basically going to copy. You know, I never had an original idea in my life, so I'm copying this little jack. But of course mine will be made out of aluminum, which, you know, yeah, possibly makes it totally worthless. But it might be a fun project for me to make, and I hope an interesting one for you to watch. You've seen these before, and we made many of these in the school shop. They were also served this purpose, but also as a spacer for our hold-down clamps on the milling machine, because they could be adjusted. And I made them according to whatever free material I was able to get at the time, and ended up with an awful lot of these, more than I could use, and you might see a student's name on the bottom of them. But the whole idea of this was showing them how to thread up to a shoulder and to bore and then internally thread the bottom part of the jack. And we made some of these with coarse threads and some with fine threads. And I assigned different threads to different students so they could not copy each other or exchange the work. So everyone had a different pitch. Well, enough on that. And this may still be a video at some time or another. I had planned that years ago, and I still haven't got around to it. I am very fond of this one also, but notice that this is a 2-ton jack. Yeah, this little thing here is a 2-ton jack. And not all of these are marked, and at least one, this is probably homemade. I'm not really sure. But aren't these beautiful? Anyway, this one is the one I'm going to make, and I probably will not have it quite this large on the top side, but notice that this is an incredibly coarse thread. It's 4 threads per inch, and it's a square thread, not an Acme thread. Really a overkill, and a testimony to the power of an inclined plane. Well, just a quick side note on my bore right. You will now find a link for Thingiverse on the description of the video on the bore right, so that anyone that would want to make a casting and make the project would be able to print out this pattern. And thank you for the person that did that. I wish I would have had that and not had to waste my time on making a wooden pattern, which is so time consuming, even for one as simple as this. In a recent video I talked about CAD. Now my CAD, remember, is cardboard aided drafting, because I do not know computer aided drafting. But sometimes I use WAD or WAD, which is wood-aided drafting or drawing, wood-aided drawing. So here is my concept for this, so that I can rough this out, which took me maybe 15 minutes, and then sit in my chair late in the evening and think how I'm going to make this as a split pattern, and then of course as a metal casting, and then how am I going to machine it. So those are my thoughts. Now this wood is horrible, I know it. That's a separate piece there. Obviously it's a dowel, but I'm using treated wood. But you know what saddens me now? They have super trees. They're called super trees because they grow so fast. Look at the growth rings on this worthless piece of wood, and you know there's no weight to it at all, and it has been pressure treated, but I think they still don't last very long. You bury them in the ground, you know, and they just disappear because it's like a piece of styrofoam. But if you look at an older piece of wood here, this is beech wood. Look at the nice even grain and how close together the annual rings are. So that's a nice piece of wood. This is beech wood now, and that's what I am using for the pattern. Maple is also a perfect wood to do a turning because it's so close grain. Well, I didn't have any. So what am I using? Well, beech wood. Where do you get beech wood, you ask? You don't. This is a piece of gymnastic equipment from the high school that I obtained probably 30 years ago, and I found it in the dumpster, or near the dumpsters of the school. Big things didn't end up in the dumpster, they just set them alongside. Well, I walked by there every day, and so I took this home, and there were probably 10 pieces of this. It's, you know, over 1.5 inches thick, and yeah, I will cut that off and throw it away, and there's varnish on there, which is a problem. But beech wood, which has been aged, by the way, has a very characteristic grain. And it doesn't show up too well there, I don't believe. But anyway, that's the wood that I'm using for my split pattern. I believe this came from the girls' gym, and they threw it away. You know, cost was no object at the high school for sports equipment. But try to get a new drill press out of them was darn near impossible, but they had plenty of money for new cheerleader outfits. And I don't object to that. I think that our cheerleaders from our school, who are like ambassadors at the conference, you know, they ought to look great. And they do. So I'm just, that's tongue-in-cheek, but you know, they had money for sports, but not for other things, is what I'm saying. That's probably typical of most schools. Okay, here's my finished pattern. No, I'm not going to show you how I made it, but at the end of this video, for special credit, there's about a dozen pictures or so, still pictures, of me with this setup in the lathe. So watch that if you feel like it. But this is the split pattern, and a split pattern is 10 times more difficult to make than just a turning like this. So this is 6 hours of work is what it is, so that's why I didn't film any of that. But let me tell you about a little problem that I had when I was doing this. Most of you have done something like this, but typically we take 2 pieces of wood for a split pattern and we glue them together and then do all of the operations on it, machining and wood turning, and then split it. Well, how do you get it apart if you glued it? Well, you put a piece of writing paper in there, computer paper, and that's what I did. See the traces of the paper, what's left. Well, I had 2 problems. Let's face it, this thing exploded on the lathe and came apart on me, and that's why you'll see it in some of the views where I ended up using a screw on the end to hold one end together. That's after it came apart. And then, by the way, I used a spur center to drive it. You'll see that in the pictures. Well, it came apart. Why did it come apart? Well, 2 reasons. I know I just repeated myself. First of all, you cannot glue wood that's already varnished or sealed or painted. So I did take it to the belt sander and I cleaned off the varnish as well as I could, but I'm sure I didn't get all of it, and in effect the wood was still sealed, so to speak. That was problem number 1. And then the other problem is that when I glue them together, sometimes it's very difficult to get them apart. Unvarnished wood, I mean virgin wood. So when I glued it, I thought, I'm not going to have that happen. And I've done this before. So instead of spreading glue over 100% of the area and then clamping it overnight, I took the glue and basically applied it just in the around the perimeter and left the middle part unglued. Well, those two things together caused it to come apart, and then I had to use a clamp and a screw. But anyway, it turned out fine. But I did have that problem. So I used my contour gauge to basically find the contour. These are semi-useful. It's kind of a gadget or a novelty, and this I've had so long that it's made in Japan. Oh man, I've had this close to probably 50 years. I've had this. It's only the second time I use it too. So anyway, that's what I'm trying to do, is follow the contour. Of course, you could make a pattern out of something like this too. And I didn't do a real good job. This is very hard wood, but you can see where I got a couple of rings here. But it's good enough for who it's for. But I'm not totally proud of it. But the holes for the alignment pins are also put in there ahead of time. You don't wait till the end. And the other little holes are to lift it out of the sand. Well, what is all of this about, you're saying? Are you going to use a core? Are those core prints? They sure look like core prints, don't they? But no, they are not core prints. These are handles. I think the Brits call them spigots. When I was 16 years old, remember the picture where I'm with my dad and Punk Harold, I had already discovered, because that was the same year I made my Stewart steam engine, that it came with some tiny little castings that defied being held. So I am almost obsessed with the fact that I need some way to hang on to a casting or a part while I'm working on it, and so that it can be held safely and securely. So what this is all about is for me to hold it in the 3-jaw chuck as an aluminum casting, and then eventually cut off the waste stock. Well, why you got one on this end, you ask? Well, that's my gate. It's easier to have a gate already built into the pattern than to try to spoon it in and then often break some of the sand apart as a fella is doing that. Notice that there is pattern draft here. That's an angle. I don't know if it shows up. Let me grab. Can you see that there is an angle there? And same thing here. And normally one would have a fillet in there, but I didn't really care. Shrinkage is always a problem on a thick cross section like this. Alright, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to cut to the footage that I had made yesterday making the sand mold out in the garage, and I'm talking a little bit about my Petra sand because people keep asking what kind of sand is that. So I talk about that a little bit. I make the mold, I pour it, I break it out, and we're going to cut to that right now, and then I'll show you the casting. So watch that. If you're sick of watching mold making and casting, you can advance through that. I put 2 coats of Deft on there, and I use Deft because it dries almost instantly, like rain on a hot sidewalk in August in Illinois. And all right, so they're sealed. I use this just to kind of seal it because the oil-based sand does kind of penetrate dry wood. So now out to the foundry I go to make up a couple of these to see how it pulls, and to make one out of aluminum. They should be iron, I know it, but they're going to be aluminum. Before I start making this sand mold, let me just talk real briefly about Petra sand. This is Petra sand that I use for my molding. And what does it consist of? Where can you buy it? I don't know where you can buy it now, to be honest with you. This stuff is 25 years old. It is not dirt. What it consists of is 4 parts. Number 1, white silica sand, fairly fine grit, not like sandblasting or filter sand. It's much finer than that. I don't know the number. All right, that's number 1. Then it also, and this is the secret here, this is the Petra powder, and I am shooting a close-up of this so you can read it. I don't know where you can get it. Now, when this sand is new, it was bright orange. It can be renewed by adding Petra powder. And then the other ingredient here, I did a close-up on that also, is the Petra oil. But I don't care what they call it. It's essentially 30-weight non-detergent. Non-detergent is important. And then there's a 4th ingredient. I do not have any of it to show you, but it's called Petra catalyst. I have no idea what it is. It's probably a deep, dark secret. You cannot pour cast iron into this sand. It's mainly for aluminum and sometimes brass, never cast iron. All right, that's all I'm going to say about the sand. And I have said that in many other videos, I think, over the years. Let's make the mold. I almost forgot to tell you that the most important ingredient of all, you absolutely positively must have a Sand Muller. Nothing else will do. This is a very small one I bought from a school. It's called a Mini-Mite. And that is the only way to mix it properly. You can't mix it just by shoveling it around in your bin. What a muller does is essentially do this. Smears the ingredients and covers every grain of sand. If every grain of sand does not have some of that binding powder and oil on it, it will not work. It will not bond properly. It'll fall apart. And I do add just a dash of oil every time I mull it. That's the secret right there. And this really isn't something you can do at home unless you've got all of this equipment. Here we go. I think it's a user. Now I'm going to make another one. Alright, it's the next day. There's the casting. I'm going to talk about that, but be sure and watch this video. It's already out in several parts on me making this little woodworking vise for my grandson Henry. You may enjoy that video as well. Also remember that a casting always ends up smaller than the pattern. That is shrinkage. There's different shrink rates for different kinds of metal. But just as an example here, let me show you and measure, for that matter, the diameter here is 2.3. Let me get it again here. 350, and I got to be careful not to get it across the, and here it is 311. So there was about 40 thousandths smaller. Now it could matter less for this, but in some projects, you know, space age or whatever, they would want to control that. Of course, the pattern maker works with a shrink rule. I've talked about that many times. I did not do that because this is just a rough project, and it doesn't matter. Could be any size. Well, that concludes part 1. Be sure and watch part 2 when available. And in that video I will cut off the gates and the sprue and the riser, and then I will machine this, and then of course have to make a screw of some sort. It won't be this size. It'll probably be 5/8 and just a V-thread, probably 5/8 11, and a swivel of some sorts that I have not designed or thought too much about. But hope you enjoyed the video where I went from a concept, the wad, the final pattern, and the castings. And now on to the machining. You see there's quite a bit to a project here which seems relatively simple, and I hope you enjoyed watching it, and I'll see you next time. This is Mr. Pete. Work safely. Over 3,000 people said, well, you fool, why didn't you make a 3D printed pattern? You're always talking about the virtues of that process. Well, I really wanted to. I'm unable to do it myself because of this irregular curve. Otherwise, I could probably do it in Tinkercad. But I am embarrassed to ask anybody to do that for me because I have imposed on several people, especially Ted. So I'm not about to ask them to do it, but this could have been made probably by, what is it, 360, yeah. But in a matter of minutes by somebody that's really good. However, it would take 6 hours to print it out, but I let that go over all night. So anyway, that's why I have reverted back to wooden pattern making, but this is incredibly time consuming. Like I said, about 6 hours to make this. And now what will probably happen is somebody will say, hey, I made that for you with Confusion 360 and it is now on Tinkercad. And if that does happen, I'll put that in the description. Please read the descriptions for my videos because I often put information in there because I cannot go back into a video and make corrections or additions. They do not allow that anymore. So that has to be done in the description.